The message came at 300 hours, when the lights aboard the diplomatic starship Avalon had dimmed to their night cycle, and most of the crew slept in their bunks. Commander Ethan Voss was not sleeping. He sat at his small desk, reviewing patrol routes along the outer colonies, when his door chimed and two armed guards from the Galactic Concord stepped inside without waiting for permission. "Commander Voss," the taller one said, a blue-skinned Alvari with 3 eyes that never blinked, "the Supreme Arbiters require your presence. Immediately." Ethan closed his datapad, stood, and followed them without a word. He had served long enough in deep space to know that nothing good ever arrived at 3 in the morning. The Galactic Concord was an alliance of 42 species spread across 3 spiral arms of the Milky Way. Humanity had joined only 11 years ago, and in those 11 years they had been reminded constantly of their place. Tier 9, the lowest rank, the newcomers, the children at a table full of ancient kings. Ethan walked through the polished corridors of the Concord's capital station on Thrasis, flanked by the guards, until they reached a chamber so large that its ceiling disappeared into shadow. Dozens of alien representatives sat in tiered rows that curved around a central platform. Every eye, sensor, and antenna turned toward him as he entered. He recognized the setup. This was not a briefing, this was a judgment. The Chief Arbiter, a massive creature that looked like a tree made of crystal, spoke in a voice that vibrated through the floor. "Commander Ethan Voss of Earth, you have been selected for a matter of galactic importance. The Karathi Dominion has demanded a binding covenant marriage between their Empress, Valith Soranai, and a human representative. After review, you have been chosen." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. He stood still, his face showing nothing, while his mind raced behind his eyes. The Karathi Dominion. He knew about them. Everyone did. They were one of the oldest and most feared empires in the galaxy. Their warriors stood 8 feet tall, covered in hard chitin plates that glowed in the dark. They had 4 arms, teeth like curved knives, and eyes like pools of liquid gold. They had conquered 60 worlds before the conquered convinced them to stop, and their empress was said to be the most dangerous of them all. "You will travel to the Karathi throne world of Kaylee's Prime," the Arbiter continued. "The ceremony will take place in 14 days. This marriage will serve as a binding peace agreement between the Dominion and the conquered. Refusal is not an option." Ethan looked around the chamber. 42 species watched him. Not one of them looked sorry. He asked only one question: who authorized this on behalf of Earth? A door opened on the side of the chamber, and Ambassador Lena Cho walked in. She was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, and she had been Earth's voice in the conquered since the beginning. She looked like she had not slept in days. Her eyes were red. "I did," she said quietly. "Ethan, I am so sorry." He stared at her. She continued, her voice breaking at the edges. "The Karathi gave us an ultimatum. Accept the marriage or they would launch a full invasion of 3 human frontier colonies. 12 million people, Ethan. We had 6 hours to decide. We had no fleet close enough to defend them. No allies willing to intervene." She swallowed hard. "They specifically requested a human, something about our genetics being symbolically powerful in their culture. And they wanted someone from the military, someone strong. Your name was at the top of every list." Ethan felt the anger rise inside him like a slow fire. Not at Lena. She had done what she had to do. But at all of them, every species sitting in this chamber who had watched humanity get sold like livestock and done nothing to stop it. He breathed in. He breathed out. The fire did not go away, but he pushed it down, deep into his gut, where it could burn quietly and fuel what came next. "I accept," he said. The chamber shifted. Murmurs rippled through the alien delegations. They had expected resistance. Tears, perhaps, begging. Some of the elder species had even prepared sedatives in case the human became violent. Instead, he stood straight, his hands at his sides, his face as calm as stone. Then he spoke again. "I have 3 requests." The Arbiter leaned forward. You are not in a position to make requests, Commander. And yet I am making them, Ethan replied evenly. First, I want a complete copy of the Karathi legal code, including the full marriage codex. Second, I want unrestricted access to the Concord's legal and historical archives. Third, I want a bottle of single malt whiskey from Earth, specifically Lagavulin 16-year. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. The Arbiter granted all three requests, mostly because none of them seemed dangerous. A few of the alien representatives exchanged confused glances. One of the Fen diplomats, a species known for their intelligence networks, leaned toward his assistant and whispered, "He is not grieving. He is preparing. Flag this." Within the hour, Ethan was escorted to a Karathi warship that had been waiting at the edge of the station. It was enormous, shaped like a black blade, and it hummed with a low energy that Ethan could feel in his teeth. The Karathi soldiers who walked him to his quarters towered over him and did not speak. They looked at him the way a predator looks at something too small to be worth eating. His quarters were sparse: a hard sleeping platform, a small table, and a window that looked out into the dark between stars. The door sealed behind him with a heavy sound that made the room feel like a cell. Ethan set the Karathi legal archive on the table. It was massive, thousands of pages of laws, traditions, rituals, and codes stretching back 11,000 years. Next to it, he placed the bottle of whiskey. He poured himself a glass, sat down, and opened the first page. He did not sleep that night, or the next. He read with the focus of a man building a weapon because that was exactly what he was doing. Somewhere in these ancient laws, written by a species that thought of him as an insect, there was a crack, a loophole, a door that no one had thought to lock because no one had ever been desperate enough or stubborn enough to look for it. Back on Thyrasis, in a dark room filled with glowing screens, the Karathi high priest reviewed the surveillance footage from Ethan's quarters. He watched the human read, page after page, hour after hour, without pause or complaint. The priest had overseen hundreds of covenant marriages. The bonded consorts always broke on the first night. They wept, they screamed, they begged. This one poured himself a drink and started studying. The priest turned to his attendant, a younger Karathi with nervous eyes. "This one does not break," he said slowly. Watch him closely." The attendant asked, "Is he dangerous?" The priest did not answer for a long time. On the screen, Ethan turned another page, took another sip, and kept reading. "I do not know," the priest finally said, "and that is what frightens me." The Karathi warship Vorath's maw cut through deep space like a black knife. Inside its corridors, 1,200 Karathi warriors moved in perfect discipline, their armored feet striking the metal floors in rhythm. And somewhere in the lower decks, locked in a small room with a growing pile of legal documents, a single human had not stopped reading for 3 days. Ethan had finished the marriage codex on the second day. By the third, he had moved on to Karathi caste law, military honor codes, and historical records of past covenant marriages. His eyes burned. His back ached. But every few hours he would find something useful, and he would mark it with a small fold in the corner of the page, and the fire in his gut would burn a little brighter. On the fourth morning, the door to his quarters slid open, and a figure stepped inside that made the room feel suddenly very small. Commander Draxus stood nearly 9 feet tall. His chiton was dark gray, scarred from dozens of battles, and his 4 arms were thick with muscle. He had a face like a carved mask, flat, hard, and utterly without kindness. 2 of his hands rested on weapons at his belt. The other 2 hung at his sides like hammers waiting to fall. "I am your handler," Draxus said. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together. "My orders are to prepare you for the ceremony. You will follow my instructions without question." Ethan looked up from his documents. "Good morning to you too." Draxus did not smile. Ethan had already learned from the Codex that Karathi did not smile the way humans did. For them, showing teeth was a challenge, a threat. He made a note to keep his own smiles to a minimum. What followed were the hardest 10 days of Ethan's life, and he had survived military training on 3 different worlds. Draxus woke him before dawn every cycle. The first trial was endurance. Ethan was forced to stand motionless in a chamber where the gravity had been tripled. His muscles screamed. His vision blurred. But he planted his feet and did not fall, even when his nose began to bleed and his knees shook so badly that the watching Karathi soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The second trial was combat. Draxus put Ethan in a sparring ring with Karathi warriors and told him to survive. The first day, he lasted 9 seconds before a blow sent him skidding across the floor. The second day, he lasted 30. By the 5th day, he was lasting 2 full minutes, and he had learned something important. Karathi fighters were powerful but predictable. They attacked in patterns based on their caste rank, and those patterns were documented in the very legal texts Ethan had been studying at night. He began to read their attacks before they threw them. On the 6th day, he dodged a strike from a Karathi soldier, stepped inside the warrior's guard, and placed his palm flat against a spot just below the second arm joint. He pressed. The warrior's arm went limp, a nerve cluster, exactly where the anatomy text said it would be. The watching soldiers went quiet. Draxus narrowed his golden eyes but said nothing. The third trial was fasting. For 3 days, Ethan was given no food. This was meant to test his submission. A hungry consort was a weak consort, easy to control. But humans, Ethan knew, had evolved as persistent hunters on the plains of Africa. His species had chased prey for days without rest. 3 days without food was unpleasant, but it was not enough to break a creature whose ancestors had survived ice ages. He used the fasting days to study more. By now, he had read over 4,000 pages of Karathi law, and he had found what he was looking for, a forgotten clause buried deep in the oldest section of the Marriage Codex, written in a dialect so ancient that most modern Karathi could not read it. He translated it word by word, and when he understood what it meant, he sat very still for a long time. Then he folded the page, placed it in his pocket, and poured himself the last of his whiskey. On the 12th day, a summons came. The Empress wanted to meet him before the ceremony. The formal dining hall aboard the Voreth's Maw was a cathedral of black stone and glowing amber light. Long tables lined the walls, filled with Karathi officers in ceremonial armor. At the far end, on a raised platform, sat Empress Valith Soranai. She was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. 8 feet tall, her chiton was not gray like her warriors but a deep, shimmering violet that pulsed with bioluminescent light. Her 4 arms were adorned with bands of gold. Her face was angular and sharp, and her eyes, enormous, golden, and ancient, tracked Ethan the moment he entered the room with the precision of a predator watching prey. Every Karathi in the hall turned to watch. They expected the human to tremble, to bow too deeply, to stammer. Ethan walked to the center of the hall, stopped at the correct distance as defined by court protocol, and bowed. He bent forward exactly 14 degrees, not the deep bow of a servant, not the nod of an inferior, but the precise angle that the Codex reserved for those of equal treaty standing. He had practiced this angle in his quarters until his back memorized it. Then he straightened up, looked the Empress in the eye, and spoke in flawless Karathi. He had spent 4 days learning the language from audio files in the ship's archive, practicing each guttural sound until his throat was raw. "Your Eminence," he said, "I understand this arrangement was not your choice either. I propose we make the best of it together." The hall went dead silent. Not a plate moved. Not a breath was taken. A human, a Tier 9 creature from a mud-colored world in an unimportant arm of the galaxy, had just addressed the Karathi Empress as a near equal, in her own language, using her own laws to justify it. Valith stared at him. Her golden eyes were impossible to read. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. 10. Ethan did not blink. He stood with his hands at his sides, his shoulders square, and his heart hammering so hard he was certain the Karathi could hear it with their enhanced senses. Then Valeth spoke. "Sit," she said, "you will dine with me." He sat at her table, the first non-Karathi in history to do so, and they ate in a silence that was not hostile but evaluating. She watched how he held his utensils, how he ate the strange Karathi food without complaint, how he met her gaze without looking away. He was performing, and she knew it, but the performance was flawless, and that in itself was a kind of message. After the meal, when Ethan had been escorted back to his quarters, Valeth sat alone in her private chamber. She replayed the moment in her mind, the bow, the words, the perfect Karathi pronunciation. Her most trusted advisor, an ancient female named Sarath, stood in the doorway. "He quoted our codex to claim standing," Valeth said quietly. "He learned our language in 4 days. He survived Draxus's trials without breaking." She paused. "He is not what they told me humans would be." "He is dangerous," Sarath replied. Valeth turned her golden eyes toward the old advisor. "Perhaps, or perhaps he is exactly what I need." She looked at the stars through her window, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "He is the boldest creature I have ever met, and I do not yet know if that makes him a fool or the most valuable consort in the galaxy." In the War Council chamber below, Draxus delivered his report to the ship's generals. His voice was flat, but there was something new in it, something that might have been respect, though he would never admit it. "The human is not breaking," he said. "He is learning. He adapts faster than any species I have trained. He studies our laws at night and fights our warriors by day, and every morning he is better than the morning before." The eldest general, a scarred veteran named Torvan who had commanded 200 campaigns, leaned forward in his chair. His golden eyes were narrow. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "we have made a mistake, not in choosing him, but in assuming that we were the ones in control of this arrangement." No one in the room disagreed. And somewhere above them in his small room, Ethan Voss folded the ancient page one more time, placed it back in his pocket, and began to plan his next move. Kaylee's prime burned orange beneath a dying red sun. The throne world of the Karathi Dominion was a planet of volcanic plains, black mountain ranges, and cities carved directly into the stone of the earth. From orbit, it looked like a world on fire. Ethan watched it grow larger through the warship's window and thought it was the most beautiful and terrifying place he had ever seen. The ceremony was scheduled for sunset, when the red sun would hang low on the horizon and paint the sky in shades of blood and copper. It was the traditional hour for binding covenant marriages, a time the Karathi believed the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin, allowing the ancestors to witness the oath. The great hall of the imperial palace was carved from a single mountain. Its ceiling rose 300 feet above the floor, supported by columns of black obsidian. Thousands of Karathi filled the tiered galleries, warriors, priests, governors, and citizens who had traveled from across the Dominion to witness this unprecedented event. Among them, in a roped-off section near the back, sat delegations from all 42 conquered species. Cameras floated through the air like silver insects, broadcasting the event to every corner of the galaxy. Ethan stood in a preparation chamber, dressed in ceremonial robes that had been altered to fit a human frame. The fabric was black and heavy, woven with threads of gold that formed ancient Karathi symbols down the sleeves. Draxus had delivered them that morning with a simple instruction: "Do not embarrass yourself." Ethan had replied, "I never do." The ceremony began with drums. Deep, thundering drums made from the stretched skin of beasts that no longer existed, beaten by priests whose faces were hidden behind masks of bone. The sound shook the floor and vibrated in Ethan's chest as he walked down the central aisle of the great hall, alone, watched by thousands of alien eyes. At the far end, on a raised platform of polished stone, stood Empress Valeth. She wore armor, not robes, because in Karathi tradition, marriage was not surrender. It was Alliance. Her violet chitin gleamed under the amber lights, and her 4 arms were spread wide in the ritual posture of receiving. Her golden eyes found Ethan the moment he entered. And they did not leave him. The first part of the ceremony was the blood exchange. A priest brought forward a ceremonial blade, curved, ancient, and sharp enough to split light. Valith drew the blade across her lower left palm. Dark blue blood welled from the cut. She extended her hand toward Ethan. He took the blade without hesitation. The entire hall leaned forward. This was the moment most bonded consorts faltered. The moment the ceremony demanded they cut their own flesh and mix their blood with a species whose biology could reject them. 3 previous consorts from other species had collapsed at this step. One had died from allergic shock. Ethan drew the blade across his palm in a single clean motion. Red human blood spilled bright against the dark metal. He pressed his palm to Valith's without flinching, and their blood mingled, red and blue swirling together. The priests chanted. The drums thundered. And somewhere in the gallery, Ambassador Lena Cho pressed her hand to her mouth and held her breath. The second part was the recitation of oaths. This was conducted entirely in ancient Karathi, a dialect so old and complex that most modern Karathi struggled with it. The consort was expected to repeat phrases fed to them by the priest, stumbling and halting, reminding everyone of their inferior position. Ethan did not stumble. He recited the oaths from memory in perfect pronunciation, with the rhythm and cadence of someone who had studied the language not for days but for a lifetime. His voice carried through the great hall, clear and steady, and the silence that followed each line was not confusion, it was shock. The priests exchanged glances. 2 of them checked their scrolls as if they suspected he had somehow cheated. He had not cheated, he had simply not slept. The third part was the submission walk. The consort was required to approach the Empress's platform, climb the 7 steps, and kneel at her feet. It was the most public act of the ceremony, a physical demonstration that the consort accepted their place beneath the sovereign. Ethan climbed the steps slowly, deliberately. Each step echoed in the silent hall. When he reached the top, he knelt. His knee touched the cold stone, and for a moment he looked exactly like what the galaxy expected, a small, soft creature bowing before an empire. Then he opened his mouth and spoke words that had not been heard in 6,000 years. "I invoke the Kael'Vorath," he said, his voice ringing through the hall like a bell struck in an empty church. "The oath of shared dominion. I speak it freely, without force, as is my right under Section 12, Passage 9 of the original Marriage Codex, ratified in the year of the third burning." The effect was immediate and violent. The high priest lunged forward, his bone mask falling from his face, shouting in a voice raw with outrage. "He cannot speak those words. The Kael'Vorath is forbidden. It is dead law." But it was not dead law. Ethan had checked. The Kael'Vorath had never been formally repealed. It had simply been forgotten, buried under thousands of years of newer legislation, assumed to be irrelevant because no consort in history had ever been bold enough or educated enough to invoke it. The oath elevated a bonded consort from the status of property to consort sovereign, a co-ruler with real legal authority within the imperial court. The hall erupted. Karathi warriors rose from their seats. Several drew weapons. The conquered delegations pressed back against the walls, terrified. The drums fell silent, and in their place was the sound of 1,000 angry voices echoing off the obsidian columns. Valith raised one of her 4 hands. The hall went quiet so fast it was as if someone had cut the sound from the air. She looked down at Ethan, still kneeling before her, his face calm, his bleeding hand pressed flat against the stone. She had known this human for only 12 days. In that time, he had survived her warriors' trials, learned her language, studied her laws more deeply than her own priests, and now, on the most watched stage in the galaxy, he had played a card that no one had seen coming. "You studied our laws to claim power," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Why? Ethan looked up at her. His eyes, brown, human, impossibly steady, met her golden ones. Not power, Empress, he said. Partnership. Your people respect strength. I am showing you mine. The silence returned. It pressed against the walls. It filled the space between them like water rising in a sealed room. Valith studied him for a long, terrible moment. Behind her, her advisors whispered urgently, "Reject the oath, punish the human, declare the ceremony void." The high priest was practically vibrating with fury. 3 generals had their hands on their swords. Then Valith Saranai, Empress of the Karathi Dominion, ruler of 60 conquered worlds, did something that had not been done in 6 millennia. She spoke the counter-oath. She completed the Kael'Vorath, word by word, in the ancient tongue, binding herself to the human not as master to servant but as sovereign to sovereign. The political earthquake was instant. Across the galaxy, news feeds exploded. Intelligence agencies on 42 worlds activated emergency protocols. The Concord's ruling council called an emergency session before the ceremony was even finished. A Tier 9 species, the youngest, weakest, most insignificant civilization in the Alliance, had just talked its way into co-ruling one of the most powerful empires in existence. In the gallery, Ambassador Lena Cho wept openly, and she was not the only one. Several human crew members aboard the Avalon, watching the broadcast from orbit, stood at attention and saluted a screen that showed a single man kneeling on alien stone, covered in his own blood, who had just rewritten the rules of the galaxy with nothing but knowledge and nerve. That night, after the feasting and the political chaos and the endless questions from frantic diplomats, Ethan found himself alone on a balcony of the Imperial Palace. Below him, the alien city stretched to the horizon, lit by rivers of flowing lava and towers of glowing crystal. The red sun had set, and 3 moons hung in the dark sky like watching eyes. He heard footsteps behind him, heavy, deliberate, unmistakable. Valith joined him at the railing. They stood side by side, 2 rulers from different worlds, bound by an oath that neither had expected to share. "What do you plan to do with your new authority?" she asked. Ethan looked at her. In the moonlight, the bioluminescent patterns on her chitin pulsed softly, and her golden eyes reflected the city below. She was alien in every way that mattered, but there was something in her voice, a weariness, a loneliness that he recognized deeply. "End the war your generals want to start," he said quietly, "and make sure no species, including mine, ever gets forced into something like this again." She studied him in silence. Then she made a sound he had never heard from a Karathi before, low, rhythmic, almost musical. It took him a moment to realize what it was. She was laughing. It was not mockery. It was something rarer and far more dangerous. It was the laughter of someone who, for the first time in a very long reign, had been genuinely surprised. 3 months had passed since the ceremony, and Ethan Voss was still alive. This surprised nearly everyone in the galaxy except Ethan himself. Life inside the Karathi Imperial Court was a maze of sharp edges, both physical and political. The palace on Caelys Prime was built for beings twice Ethan's size, and every doorway, staircase, and chair reminded him that he was a guest in a world not designed for humans. But it was not the architecture that threatened to kill him. It was the politics. The Karathi Dominion was ruled by castes. The warrior caste held the most power, followed by the priests, the governors, and the merchant guilds. At the top sat the Empress, whose word was law. And now, standing beside her with legal authority that no outsider had ever held, stood a human who weighed less than most Karathi children. Not everyone was pleased about this arrangement. Grand Warlord Thesic was Valith's uncle on her father's side, a towering figure with battle scars that covered his chitin like a map of violence. He commanded the loyalty of the Dominion's largest military fleet and controlled the resource-rich outer territories. He had opposed the marriage from the beginning, and Ethan's invocation of the Kael'Vorath had turned his opposition into something darker and more dangerous. Thesic never threatened Ethan directly. He was too smart for that. Instead, he worked through whispers, through allies, through carefully placed insults and small humiliations designed to chip away at Ethan's standing. At a military review, Thesic arranged for Ethan's seat to be placed below the salt line, a Karathi gesture of contempt. At a council meeting, one of Thesic's generals referred to Ethan as the Empress's exotic pet, loud enough for the entire chamber to hear. The general's name was Korvan. He was a decorated officer with arms like tree trunks and a reputation for cruelty that extended across 3-star systems. When he made his comment, the council chamber rippled with nervous laughter. Valith's eyes flashed with anger, but before she could respond, Ethan stood. The laughter stopped. "General Korvan," Ethan said, his voice level and clear, "under Article 7 of the Imperial Honor Code, your words constitute a formal insult against a member of the sovereign house. I invoke the Vorshai, the right of challenge, as is my right as consort sovereign." The chamber went cold. The Vorshai was an ancient tradition, a public duel of combat or trial that could not be refused without permanent loss of honor. It was meant for disputes between Karathi nobles, not for challenges from aliens who barely reached the chest of the weakest warrior in the room. Korvan looked at Ethan the way a mountain looks at a pebble. "I accept," he said, and his mouth opened wide enough to show every one of his curved teeth. "I choose combat." The duel was scheduled for the following day, in the great arena of Kaylee's Prime, a coliseum carved into the side of a dormant volcano, where Karathi warriors had settled disputes for thousands of years. The news spread across the Dominion within hours. A human was going to fight a Karathi general in single combat. The betting odds were 700 to 1 against Ethan. Draxus came to Ethan's quarters that night. The massive warrior priest stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Over the past 3 months, something had shifted between them. Draxus had been assigned to break Ethan, and he had failed. That failure had created a grudging bond that neither of them spoke about openly. "You will die tomorrow," Draxus said flatly. "Probably," Ethan replied. He was stretching on the floor, loosening muscles that would need to work faster than they had ever worked before. "But probably is not certainly. Korvan has killed 40 opponents in the arena." 40 opponents who fought like Karathi. Ethan stood and looked up at Draxus. "I will not fight like Karathi." Draxus stared at him for a long moment, then reached to his belt and removed a small data chip. He placed it on the table. "Korvan's medical records. He has an old injury, second vertebral plate on his left side. It never healed properly." He turned and walked toward the door. "I did not give you this." Ethan picked up the chip. "Thank you, Draxus." The warrior priest paused at the door. "Do not thank me, win." The arena held 20,000 spectators, and every seat was filled. The noise was deafening, a wall of sound made up of roaring voices, stamping feet, and the clash of weapons beaten against shields. Floating cameras broadcast every angle to billions of viewers across the Dominion and beyond. In the Concord's diplomatic quarters, alien representatives gathered around screens with expressions ranging from fascination to horror. Korvan entered first. He was enormous, 9 feet of armored muscle, carrying a ceremonial blade in each of his 4 hands. The crowd roared his name like a war chant. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never once considered the possibility of defeat. Then Ethan entered. He wore light combat gear, fitted, flexible, human-made. He carried no weapon. The crowd noise shifted from roaring to murmuring. Some laughed. A few shook their heads in what might have been pity. The signal to begin was a single low horn blast that echoed off the volcanic walls. Korvan charged immediately. He was fast for his size, terrifyingly fast, all 4 arms swinging in coordinated arcs designed to overwhelm any defender. The blades cut through the air with sounds like tearing fabric. Ethan did not try to block. He could not block. A single direct hit from any of those arms would shatter his bones like glass. Instead, he moved. He had spent 3 months studying Karathi combat, not just the techniques but the philosophy behind them. Karathi warriors fought like avalanches. They pressed forward, overwhelming opponents with power and aggression. They expected their enemies to stand and fight, or to run and be chased down. They did not expect what Ethan did. He sidestepped, he ducked, he spun. He moved in patterns that were completely alien to Karathi combat doctrine, patterns drawn from boxing, judo, capoeira, and a dozen other human martial arts that had been developed over centuries of fighting opponents bigger and stronger than the fighter. He was not trying to overpower Korvan. He was trying to exhaust him. Korvan swung. Ethan was not there. Korvan lunged. Ethan rolled beneath his guard and came up behind him. Korvan spun with a backhand that would have taken Ethan's head off, but Ethan had already moved again, reading the attack before it happened because every Karathi warrior attacked in patterns determined by their caste training, and Ethan had memorized every pattern. The crowd grew quiet. The laughter was gone. 2 minutes in, Korvan was breathing hard. His attacks were wider, slower, driven by frustration. Ethan saw his opening. He feinted left, drawing Korvan's upper arms, then darted right and drove his palm into the weak point on the second vertebral plate, the old injury Draxus had told him about. Korvan gasped. His left side seized, and his lower arms dropped to his sides. Ethan stepped in close, faster than thought, and struck 3 nerve clusters in rapid succession, targets he had identified during months of studying Karathi anatomy in the palace library. Korvan's legs buckled. The great general crashed to the arena floor like a falling building, and the ground shook when he landed. The arena was silent. 20,000 Karathi held their breath. Ethan stood over Korvan, breathing hard, his hands trembling from the effort. Every instinct in the arena, every tradition, every precedent said this was the moment to finish the opponent. To kill. That was how the Vorshai ended. Ethan reached down and offered his hand. Korvan lay on the ground, stunned, his golden eyes wide. He stared at the small human hand extended toward him, 5 soft fingers, no claws, no chitin, no armor. The hand of a creature from a mud world who had just defeated one of the Dominion's most feared warriors without drawing a single drop of blood. Korvan took the hand. Ethan helped him to his feet. The silence broke, not into cheering but into something deeper. A low, resonant hum that started in the upper galleries and spread downward. It was the Karathi sound of respect, a sound reserved for moments of genuine honor, and Ethan had never heard it directed at a non-Karathi before. By the end of that week, Korvan had pledged his personal loyalty to Ethan. It was not submission, it was recognition. He had been beaten fairly, spared generously, and that combination was sacred in Karathi warrior culture. 2 provincial governors followed Korvan's example, then a fleet commander, then 3 more officers. The foundation of Thesic's conspiracy was crumbling, and the old warlord knew it. Desperate, Thesic played his final card. He ordered a covert strike on a Karathi border colony, a brutal attack designed to look like it came from the conquered. If it worked, it would trigger the full-scale galactic war that the marriage had been arranged to prevent. Millions would die. Thesic did not care. War was profitable for the warrior caste, and a dead human consort would be a convenient casualty. But Ethan had been watching. With intelligence gathered by Draxus and communications intercepted by Korvan's now loyal officers, Ethan assembled a complete record of Thesic's conspiracy. Every message, every order, every transfer of weapons and funds. He presented the evidence to the Imperial War Council in a session broadcast live across the Dominion. Thesic stood on the opposite side of the chamber, his scarred face twisted with rage. "You are nothing," he snarled, his voice shaking with contempt. "A creature from a mud world playing at Empire. You do not belong here. You will never belong here." Ethan stood. He was shorter than everyone in the room. He was softer. He was weaker. And yet when he spoke, every being in that chamber listened. "I am the creature from the mud world," he said quietly, "who stopped your war, protected your empress, and dismantled your conspiracy with a legal code you never bothered to read." He paused, letting the words settle into the silence. "Humanity does not play at Empire, Warlord. We rewrite the rules." The council voted unanimously. Thesic was stripped of his rank, his territories, and his fleet. He was exiled to the frozen outer moons, where he would spend the rest of his long life staring at the stars and knowing that he had been outmaneuvered by the smallest being in the room. That evening, Valith found Ethan in the palace library, surrounded by the books and documents that had been his weapons from the very beginning. She stood in the doorway, watching him, and there was an expression on her face that her court had never seen before. It was pride, not the pride of a ruler for a subject, the pride of a partner for an equal. She stepped into the room and sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. They did not need to. Something had changed between them, something that went beyond politics or treaties or ancient oaths. It was trust, real, hard-earned, and unbreakable. 1 year. That was all it had taken. 1 year since a human soldier had been sold into a marriage he never asked for, shipped to an alien world in chains of diplomacy, and expected to disappear quietly into the background of galactic history. 1 year since Ethan Voss had poured himself a glass of whiskey, opened a book of ancient alien law, and decided that he would not be forgotten. The galaxy had changed since then, and it had changed because of him. The first reform came 3 months after Thesic's exile. Ethan drafted it himself, writing in both human English and formal Karathi, and presented it to Valith over a late meal in the private chambers they now shared. It was a simple document, barely 2 pages long, but its implications were enormous. The complete abolition of forced binding covenant marriages within the Karathi dominion. Valith read it twice, set it down, and looked at him with her ancient golden eyes. "This will anger the traditionalists," she said. "The traditionalists are always angry," Ethan replied. "That is what makes them traditional." She made that low, rhythmic sound he had come to recognize as laughter, a sound that, 1 year ago, no living being had ever heard from a Karathi empress. She signed the document that night. It became law the next morning. The second reform was larger. Working with Ambassador Lena Cho and a team of human and Karathi legal scholars, Ethan proposed a complete restructuring of the galactic conquered species ranking system. Under the old system, species were ranked by age. The older your civilization, the higher your tier. This meant that ancient empires held permanent power, while younger species were trapped at the bottom regardless of their contributions, their innovations, or their sacrifices. Ethan's proposal was radical. He suggested ranking species by contribution, scientific discoveries, cultural exchanges, peacekeeping efforts, and diplomatic achievements. The system would be reviewed every decade. No rank would be permanent. Every species would have to earn its place. The Concord's ruling council debated the proposal for 6 weeks. The oldest species fought against it. They had enjoyed their positions at the top for millennia and had no interest in sharing. But Ethan had spent months building alliances with mid-tier and lower-tier species who had suffered under the old system. One by one, delegations added their voices in support. The vote, when it finally came, passed by a margin of 31 to 11. Under the new system, humanity was reclassified from Tier 9 to Tier 3. It was the fastest ascension in conquered history, and it sent a message that echoed across every inhabited world. The age of silent submission was over. Not everyone celebrated. In the intelligence offices of a dozen elder species, analysts worked through the night, compiling reports on human behavior, psychology, and history. What they found disturbed them. Humans had been on the galactic stage for barely more than a decade, and in that time, a single member of their species had married into an alien empire, claimed co-sovereign status through legal maneuvering, defeated a warrior 3 times his size in single combat, dismantled a military conspiracy, abolished an ancient tradition, restructured the galactic power hierarchy, and done it all without firing a single weapon or commanding a single warship. A classified intelligence report was compiled and distributed to the highest levels of conquered leadership. It was 700 pages long, but its conclusion was a single paragraph that would be quoted, debated, and feared for generations to come. It read, "Humans do not conquer through force. They conquer through integration. They study your laws until they know them better than you do. They learn your language, your customs, your weaknesses. They earn the loyalty of your own people. And by the time you realize what has happened, they are already part of your system and they have changed it from within. They are not warriors. They are something far more dangerous. They are adapters." Ethan never saw the report, but he would not have been surprised by it. He had not set out to frighten the galaxy. He had set out to survive. The fact that survival for a human looked like conquest to everyone else was not his problem. As the months passed, Ethan and Valeth settled into a partnership that defied every expectation. It was not a human romance. Valeth's species did not experience emotion the way humans did, and their biology made physical intimacy in the human sense impossible. But what they built was something deeper and stranger, a bond of absolute trust between two beings who had been forced together by politics and chosen to stay together by will. They worked side by side in the council chambers, balancing each other's instincts. Where Valeth was decisive and commanding, Ethan was patient and strategic. Where she led with the authority of a 1,000-year throne, he led with the quiet persuasion of someone who understood that the most powerful weapon in any room was the ability to listen. She taught him the weight of ruling an empire. He taught her that strength could be gentle without being weak. Late at night, when the palace was quiet and the red sun had set, they would sit together on the balcony where they had spoken on their wedding night. Sometimes they talked about policy. Sometimes they talked about their childhoods, hers in the brutal training halls of the Karathi royal caste, his on a farm in a small country on a small planet in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the 3 moons cross the dark sky, 2 rulers from different worlds who had found in each other something neither had expected: understanding. The invitation to address the full galactic conquered arrived on the anniversary of the marriage. All 42 species would be assembled in the Great Forum on Thyrassus, the same station where Ethan had been told, 1 year ago, that his life was no longer his own. He almost declined. He was not a politician or a speechmaker. He was a soldier who had been handed a book and told to survive, but Valeth convinced him. "They need to hear it from you," she said. "Not from me, not from an ambassador, from the human who walked into their cage and walked out wearing a crown." The Great Forum was even larger than Ethan remembered. Its curved galleries rose so high that the upper tiers were lost in shadow. Representatives from every species in the conquered filled the seats, beings of crystal and light, creatures of water and gas, insects the size of horses, sentient plants that communicated through scent. Every eye, sensor, lens, and antenna was focused on the small platform in the center of the floor. Ethan walked to the podium alone. No guards, no escort, just a man in a uniform that bore both human and Karathi insignia standing under the gaze of the galaxy. He spoke plainly, in simple words, because he believed that the truth did not need decoration. 1 year ago, I was traded like cargo to prevent a war. I was expected to be quiet, grateful, and obedient. I was expected to kneel and stay down. He paused. Instead, I read your laws. I learned your customs. And I earned my place, not because humans are better than anyone in this room, but because we refuse to believe that survival means giving up. He looked across the hall, meeting as many eyes as he could. "We are the youngest species in this conquered. We are the smallest, the softest, the shortest-lived, but we are here, and we will keep being here, not as your servants, not as your weapons, but as your partners." His voice hardened just slightly. "The galaxy is wide enough for all of us, but if anyone ever again tries to put a chain on one of my people and call it diplomacy, they will learn something about humans that no intelligence report can teach them." He let the silence hold for a beat. "They will learn what we do when we have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." He stepped back from the podium. The hall was silent. 3 seconds passed, 5, an eternity. Then the Karathi delegation stood. Valith rose first, tall and shining under the lights, and inclined her head, the deepest gesture of respect her species could offer. Korvan stood behind her, his massive frame casting a shadow across the gallery, his 4 fists pressed against his chest in the warrior's salute. Draxus stood beside them, his scarred face unreadable except for the smallest movement at the corner of his mouth, something that on a Karathi might have been a smile. Other delegations followed. Not all of them, some remained seated, their ancient pride too heavy to bend. But enough stood, more than enough. The sound of chairs scraping and bodies rising filled the hall like a slow wave, and by the time it was finished, more than 30 species were on their feet. The broadcast went out to every corner of the galaxy. On Earth, in a farmhouse that still grew wheat under an open sky, Ethan's mother watched her son stand before the stars and wept into her hands. Later, aboard the Avalon, which had remained in orbit around Thyrassus as a permanent diplomatic vessel, Ethan sat alone in the observation deck. The stars outside were the same stars he had watched as a boy, lying on his back in a wheat field, imagining what might be out there. He had found out. It was beautiful and terrible and nothing like he had imagined, and he would not trade it for anything. Ambassador Lena Cho found him there. She sat down beside him, the way she had a year ago when she had told him his life had been signed away. They were quiet for a while. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had refused?" she asked. Ethan took a slow breath and shook his head. "I did not refuse because I knew something they did not." "What?" He turned to her. For a moment the titles fell away: the consort sovereign, the reformer, the man who had rewritten the rules of a galaxy. He was just Ethan, from a small farm on a small world, impossibly far from home, who had bet everything on the one thing no species in the galaxy had thought to take seriously: the stubbornness of the human spirit. He smiled. "The best way to break a cage," he said, "is to make them hand you the keys." Outside the window, the stars burned on, ancient, patient, and infinite. Somewhere among them, on a throne world of black stone and amber light, an empress watched the same sky and thought about the strange, small creature who had walked into her world in chains and changed everything. The galaxy was not done being surprised by humanity. It was only the beginning.